Tonight, dear friend, we travel back to a quiet American morning in the autumn of 1884. Before the first rays of sunlight reach the prairie, a lone teacher lights a small oil lamp inside a one-room wooden schoolhouse. Outside, the fields glisten with dew, horses pull wagons along dusty roads, and the laughter of children has not yet begun. Tonight, we'll gently discover the forgotten life of one of America's quietest heroes, the country schoolteacher. Before sunrise. Tonight, dear friend, settle into a comfortable place. Let the worries of the modern world slowly drift away, and allow your breathing to become just a little slower. As always, there's no need to stay awake until the very end. This story was made to accompany you gently toward rest, one quiet moment at a time. Tonight, we travel back to the American countryside of the 1880s, where life followed the seasons instead of clocks, where neighbors knew one another by name, and where a single wooden schoolhouse stood at the heart of a farming community. Together, we'll discover the forgotten life of an American schoolteacher, not through grand historical events, but through the peaceful routines that quietly shaped generations. Long before the first hint of sunlight reached the rolling prairie, the countryside already held a gentle kind of life. The stars still shimmered overhead, scattered across an endless sky that seemed almost close enough to touch. A cool autumn breeze wandered softly through the tall prairie grasses, carrying with it the earthy scent of harvested fields and damp soil left behind by the evening dew. Far in the distance, a lone owl offered its final call before surrendering the night to the coming morning. The world remained wonderfully quiet. Inside a modest, white-painted farmhouse, tucked between rows of cornfields and grazing pasture, a small oil lamp suddenly flickered to life. Its warm, golden glow pushed gently against the darkness. The room it illuminated was simple but welcoming. A handmade quilt covered a narrow bed. A rocking chair rested beside a small cast-iron stove. A worn Bible, several well-used school books, and a leather-bound attendance register sat neatly, stacked upon a pine table polished smooth by many years of careful use. This was home, not grand, not luxurious, simply comfortable. The schoolteacher had learned long ago that peaceful routines often began before the rest of the world had even opened its eyes. Slowly, a pair of feet touched the cool wooden floor. The floorboards answered with a familiar creak, a sound so ordinary that it had become part of every morning's quiet conversation. Outside, darkness still covered the fields. Inside, another school day was quietly beginning. The teacher carefully added another small piece of firewood to yesterday's glowing embers. Soon the tiny flames stretched upward once again. Their gentle crackling filled the room with warmth. Wood smoke drifted softly toward the chimney, bringing with it the comforting smell that every farmhouse seemed to know by heart. Nearby, a black kettle rested above the growing fire. Before long, tiny bubbles began dancing along its edges. There would be no hurried breakfast. Life in rural America rarely encouraged rushing. Instead, mornings unfolded patiently, almost as though the day itself wished to wake slowly. A loaf of homemade bread waited beneath a linen cloth. Fresh butter, churned only yesterday afternoon, rested in a cool stone crock. There were apples gathered from a nearby orchard. A small jar of blackberry preserves caught the soft lamplight like polished amber. Breakfast was wonderfully ordinary. A slice of bread toasted beside the stove. Butter slowly melted into its warm surface. Apple slices added a touch of sweetness. A steaming cup of coffee filled the room with its rich aroma, though many country teachers also enjoyed warm milk or tea depending upon local custom and personal preference. Outside, another sound finally joined the quiet morning. A rooster crowed somewhere beyond the barn. Another answered across the fields. Soon a chorus of distant farm animals gently announced that the countryside was beginning another day. The teacher smiled almost without thinking. Those familiar sounds had become faithful companions over the years. There was comfort in knowing that every neighboring family was beginning much the same routine. Fires were being lit. Bread was being sliced. Children were slowly waking beneath heavy quilts. Horses shifted patiently inside wooden barns. The entire countryside awakened together, not by command, but by habit. After breakfast, attention turned toward the day's lessons. A sturdy leather satchel rested upon the table. One by one, its contents were arranged with quiet care. A small Bible, McGuffey's eclectic reader, a well-used arithmetic book, copybooks filled with careful handwriting, fresh sticks of chalk wrapped in cloth, a bottle of dark ink, several steel pen nibs, a folded map of the United States. Every object had its place. Nothing unnecessary traveled inside the satchel. Each item would help guide a classroom where children as young as 6 and as old as 16 often learned together beneath one roof. Teaching such a classroom required organization more than perfection. The teacher checked everything once more. Habits like these brought reassurance. There would always be unexpected moments during the day. Perhaps someone's slate would crack. Perhaps a younger child would struggle with reading. Perhaps winter winds might whistle through the walls. Preparing carefully before sunrise made every challenge feel just a little smaller. Warm clothing came next. A neatly pressed cotton shirt, a wool vest, a long dark skirt or sturdy wool trousers, depending on whether the teacher was a woman or a man. A thick coat waited beside the door. Strong leather boots had already been polished the evening before. Practical clothing mattered greatly. The nearest schoolhouse stood nearly 2 miles away. Every morning and every afternoon, that distance would be walked regardless of weather. Rain, snow, mud, bright sunshine. The school bell waited for no one. The little farmhouse grew quieter once again as the teacher carefully blew out the oil lamp. Now the only light came from glowing embers inside the stove and the faint silver moon filtering through the windows. The front door opened with a gentle groan. Cool morning air immediately wrapped around everything. It carried the sweet scent of drying hay, fallen leaves, and distant cedar trees. The sky had begun changing almost imperceptibly. A deep midnight blue slowly softened toward gentle shades of gray. Far across the eastern horizon, the faintest ribbon of pale gold quietly appeared. Morning was on its way. The walk to school was never simply a journey. It was a peaceful invitation to notice the changing seasons. Gravel crunched softly beneath sturdy boots. Tiny drops of dew sparkled upon every blade of prairie grass. Spiderwebs stretched between weathered fence posts, each one decorated with dozens of shining droplets that reflected the first hints of dawn. Wild rabbits occasionally paused beside the path before disappearing silently into the tall grass. A small flock of meadowlarks lifted gracefully into the cool morning air, their cheerful songs becoming one of the day's first melodies. The teacher slowed for just a moment. There was no reason to hurry. The schoolhouse would still be waiting. The fields would still be wrapped in morning mist. The children would not arrive for another hour. Moments like these often became the most treasured part of the entire day. As another gentle breeze crossed the open prairie, the weathered silhouette of the one-room schoolhouse gradually emerged from the morning fog, standing quietly beside a simple white fence, as though it had been patiently waiting all through the night for another day of learning to begin. Opening the schoolhouse. The little schoolhouse stood quietly at the edge of the prairie, its white painted wooden walls softly glowing beneath the first golden light of dawn. It was neither grand nor impressive, yet to the families scattered across these rolling fields, it represented something deeply valuable. Within those simple walls, children learned not only how to read and write, but also how to understand the growing nation around them. The teacher paused for a brief moment beside the front gate. a gentle breeze stirred the tall prairie grass until it rippled like quiet waves upon an endless green sea. Somewhere beyond a distant hill, cattle called softly to one another while a pair of horses patiently waited beside a weathered fence, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Everything felt wonderfully unhurried. Reaching into a coat pocket, the teacher removed a heavy iron key attached to a smooth leather strap worn from years of faithful use. The old lock answered with a familiar click. The wooden door opened slowly, offering its usual gentle creak that echoed through the empty room. A faint scent of aged pine boards, chalk dust, lamp oil, and yesterday's firewood lingered quietly inside. The classroom had patiently waited through another peaceful night. The teacher stepped inside and closed the door against the cool autumn breeze. For a few moments, silence filled every corner. Rows of handmade wooden desks rested exactly where the previous afternoon had left them. Each desk bore tiny marks of childhood, carefully carved initials, faint ink stains, and the smooth polish created by countless young hands resting upon the wood over many years. Near the front stood a large blackboard framed with sturdy oak. Yesterday's arithmetic lesson still lingered faintly across its surface, waiting to be gently erased. Beside it rested a simple wooden pointer, worn smooth from daily use. There were no electric lights, no humming machines, no glowing screens. Only quiet simplicity. The teacher crossed the room toward the cast iron stove standing proudly near the center of the classroom. During the warmer months, it served only as another piece of furniture. But now, as autumn steadily approached winter, it would soon become the warm heart of the schoolhouse. Opening the small iron door revealed a bed of cool gray ashes left from the day before. Carefully, the teacher knelt beside the stove. Small pieces of dry oak kindling were arranged with practiced hands. A few twisted sheets of old newspaper found their place beneath the wood. One careful strike of a match filled the room with the familiar scent of sulfur before a tiny yellow flame quietly appeared. Within moments, the fire awakened. Soft crackling replaced the morning silence. Thin ribbons of wood smoke drifted upward through the stovepipe before disappearing into the chimney overhead. Soon, gentle warmth began spreading across the classroom. The teacher smiled. Children would arrive with cold hands and rosy cheeks. The room needed to greet them with comfort. Nearby rested 2 galvanized buckets waiting beside the doorway. Fresh water was needed before lessons could begin. Just beyond the schoolhouse stood a hand-operated well beneath a broad cottonwood tree. Morning sunlight now reached the upper branches, where dozens of sparrows fluttered happily among the leaves. The teacher lowered the metal bucket into the cool darkness below. A distant splash echoed upward. Then came the steady rhythm of lifting. The wooden handle creaked softly with every turn. Soon, crystal-clear water shimmered beneath the morning sky. The buckets felt pleasantly heavy during the short walk back inside. One would be used for drinking, the other for washing slates and cleaning ink-stained hands before the children returned home. Water, like nearly everything else in rural life, required quiet effort before it could be enjoyed. Next came the classroom itself. A straw broom leaned patiently against the wall. The teacher swept slowly across the wide plank floor, gathering yesterday's bits of dried mud, tiny leaves carried in on children's boots, and a little chalk dust that had settled overnight. Each gentle sweep filled the room with another familiar sound. Nothing dramatic, nothing hurried, simply another small task completed with care. As sunlight slowly climbed higher, warm beams began slipping through the tall windows. Golden light stretched across the wooden floorboards before climbing quietly over desks, books, and the teacher's own chair. Tiny dust particles floated through those bright columns of light like countless miniature stars. For just a moment, the empty classroom seemed almost magical, not because of anything extraordinary, but because ordinary places often become beautiful when morning light quietly fills them. The teacher picked up a soft felt eraser and carefully wiped yesterday's lessons from the blackboard. Numbers disappeared. Words faded away. Fresh space appeared. Ready for another day. A neat line of cursive letters was written across the top. Good morning. Below it came today's date. Then a simple sentence for penmanship practice. Kindness makes every lesson easier. Children would spend part of the morning carefully copying those words into their notebooks, improving both their handwriting and their patience one careful letter at a time. One by one, books found their proper places. McGuffey readers were stacked neatly according to reading level. Spelling books rested beside them. Arithmetic texts waited nearby. A small globe was placed upon its wooden stand near the teacher's desk. Though many of the children might never travel farther than the neighboring county, they loved watching the little globe spin beneath gentle fingertips, imagining oceans, mountains, and distant lands they knew only through stories. Beside the windows stood several healthy potted plants. One contained ivy slowly climbing its support. Another held bright geranium flowers carefully watered by the oldest students each week. The teacher checked each one, adding a little fresh water before gently turning the pots so every leaf could enjoy the morning sunshine. Even the smallest acts of care helped make the classroom feel welcoming. Soon the first distant sound reached the schoolhouse. Not voices, not laughter, just the slow creaking of wooden wagon wheels somewhere beyond the hill. Families had begun their journeys. Some children walked several miles each morning. Others arrived riding bareback horses or sharing farm wagons with brothers and sisters wrapped in wool blankets against the crisp air. The teacher stepped outside once more. From the small front porch, the countryside stretched endlessly beneath a brightening blue sky. Golden fields shimmered softly beneath the morning sun. Thin ribbons of chimney smoke rose peacefully from distant farmhouses. A flock of geese crossed high overhead, their gentle calls fading slowly into the distance as they continued their long autumn journey south. The day was fully awake now, yet one final task remained. Hanging beside the schoolhouse entrance was a polished brass bell attached to a sturdy rope. Its purpose was wonderfully simple. It called children together. It marked the beginning of lessons. It reminded every family across the nearby prairie that another quiet day of learning had begun. The teacher wrapped one hand around the smooth rope, took a slow, steady breath, and with a gentle pull sent the clear, welcoming sound of the school bell drifting across the peaceful countryside, inviting eager young minds toward another ordinary day that would one day become history itself. The children arrived. The clear, gentle sound of the brass school bell drifted across the prairie like a friendly invitation carried on the morning breeze. Its steady notes echoed over harvested cornfields, crossed quiet dirt roads, and floated beyond weathered barns where farm families were finishing the first chores of the day. For many children, that familiar bell marked the beginning of something they genuinely looked forward to. Learning was work, but it was also adventure. Standing on the small wooden porch, the teacher watched the countryside slowly come alive. The first figure to appear was hardly more than a silhouette against the golden morning light. A young boy, perhaps 7 years old, walked steadily along the narrow wagon track with a small tin lunch pail swinging gently from one hand. His oversized wool coat reached almost to his knees, and a knitted scarf, carefully made by his mother, wrapped twice around his neck. Every few steps he paused to admire something only children seemed to notice. A bright red leaf, a rabbit darting through the grass, a butterfly lingering on a wildflower before beginning its own busy morning. Nothing about the journey felt rushed. Soon another child appeared farther down the road, then two sisters walking hand in hand. Behind them rolled a sturdy farm wagon pulled by a patient brown horse. Three brothers sat together on a wooden bench, laughing quietly as their father guided the wagon toward the schoolhouse before continuing on to the fields. As each family arrived, greetings were exchanged with easy familiarity. "Good morning. Beautiful weather today. Drive safely. I'll see you this afternoon." The schoolhouse was more than a place of learning. It was one of the few places where neighbors met almost every day. News was shared. Friendships quietly grew. Small kindnesses became lasting memories. One little girl carefully carried a bouquet of late summer wildflowers gathered along the roadside. Without saying a word, she placed them inside a simple glass jar resting upon the teacher's desk. Fresh flowers often appeared there, sometimes daisies, sometimes goldenrod, sometimes tiny blue asters blooming beside nearby streams. No one had ever assigned this task. The children simply understood that beauty belonged inside their classroom. The teacher smiled warmly. "Thank you," came the gentle reply. The little girl nodded shyly before joining her classmates. Inside the schoolhouse, cheerful sounds gradually replaced the peaceful silence that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Boots tapped softly against wooden floors. Lunch pails rested beneath desks. Coats were carefully hung upon wooden pegs fastened along the back wall. The warmth from the cast iron stove greeted every child who stepped inside. Many stretched their cold hands toward it for just a few moments before taking their seats. Rosy cheeks slowly returned to their normal color. Frosty fingers became comfortable once again. The classroom itself was wonderfully simple. Older students naturally chose desks near the back. Younger children preferred the front rows where they could more easily hear every lesson. Brothers and sisters often sat close together, not because anyone insisted, because it simply felt familiar. The youngest students glanced curiously around the room. For a few of them, this was only their second or third week of school. Everything still felt wonderfully new. The polished wooden desks, the large blackboard, the spinning globe, the shelves filled with books whose pages promised stories from places far beyond the prairie. One small boy carefully removed his slate from its cloth bag. Using the sleeve of his jacket, he polished away yesterday's chalk marks until the surface looked perfectly clean. Nearby, an older student quietly helped his younger sister sharpen a pencil with a small pocket knife. Acts of kindness like these happened almost without notice. In a one-room schoolhouse, children learned from one another nearly as often as they learned from the teacher. The teacher moved gently through the classroom, greeting every child by name. "Good morning, Clara." "How is your grandmother feeling today, Samuel?" "Did your father's new calf finally arrive?" The questions were simple. The answers were sincere. School was never separated from community life. Every family knew something of the others. If someone's barn needed repairing, neighbors appeared. If illness visited a farmhouse, meals quietly arrived at the doorstep. If winter snow blocked the roads, older boys helped clear paths before lessons could begin. The school reflected that same spirit. Near one window sat a sturdy wooden shelf holding several treasured library books. There were stories of American pioneers, collections of poems, simple geography readers, and books about birds, forests, rivers, and distant mountains. Many children had never traveled beyond neighboring counties. Yet through books they visited oceans, deserts, great cities, and ancient civilizations. The teacher often believed those quiet pages carried children farther than any railroad ever could. Outside, more wagons continued arriving. The sound of horses snorting softly mixed with the creaking of leather harnesses. Parents offered cheerful waves before turning back toward waiting fields and unfinished chores. Harvest season left little time unused. Corn needed gathering. Hay needed stacking. Fences required repair before winter arrived. Yet every family understood the importance of these few precious hours spent inside the little white schoolhouse. Education required sacrifice. Children were often needed on the farm. Even so, parents hoped reading, writing, and arithmetic would open doors their own generation had never known. As the last student entered, the classroom settled into a gentle hush. 23 children now filled the room. The youngest was only 6, the oldest nearly 16. Some already stood taller than the teacher. Others could barely see over the tops of their desks. Yet for the coming hours, they would all learn together beneath the same roof. The teacher walked toward the front of the room. Morning sunlight streamed through the eastern windows, bathing the blackboard in warm golden light. The bouquet of wildflowers brightened the desk with touches of purple and yellow. The fire inside the stove crackled softly, adding its comforting rhythm to the quiet room. Removing a small Bible from the desk, the teacher read a brief passage often chosen for its encouragement toward honesty, kindness, and perseverance. Values that many rural schools of the era considered an important part of daily life. The reading was calm and unhurried. Afterward came a simple moment of silent reflection. No child fidgeted for long. The peaceful stillness seemed almost natural. When the book was gently closed, the teacher smiled across the room. "Good morning, everyone." 23 cheerful voices answered together. "Good morning!" The greeting filled the little schoolhouse with warmth, not simply because of the words, but because it reminded everyone that another ordinary day had begun. A day of reading, questions, laughter, careful handwriting, quiet discoveries, and countless small moments that would someday become treasured memories. The teacher picked up a piece of fresh white chalk and turned toward the blackboard. With slow, careful strokes, today's first lesson appeared. The soft scratching of chalk became the morning's first classroom sound. Outside, the prairie breeze continued its gentle journey through the tall grass, while inside, 23 curious young minds prepared to begin another peaceful day of learning together beneath the wide American sky. Lessons of the Frontier. The final line of white chalk settled gently beneath the morning's first lesson, and the teacher placed the chalk back upon its narrow wooden ledge. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The only sounds came from the steady crackle of the cast-iron stove and the faint whisper of an autumn breeze brushing against the clapboard walls outside. Morning sunlight now filled nearly every corner of the little classroom. Golden beams rested across polished desktops, warmed the worn pages of well-loved books, and painted soft patterns upon the wide plank floor. It was the sort of quiet that did not feel empty. Instead, it felt welcoming, comfortable, almost like the peaceful hush inside a country church before the congregation arrived. The teacher looked slowly around the room. 23 eager faces looked back. Some children sat perfectly still, hands folded neatly upon their desks. Others leaned forward with bright eyes, curious about what the day might bring. The youngest students swung their feet gently beneath oversized benches that had been built for children of every age. Older students already held sharpened pencils in quiet anticipation. Teaching in a one-room schoolhouse required more than knowledge. It required patience, careful planning, and a calm spirit. Unlike modern classrooms, every child followed a different stage of learning. One corner of the room might be practicing the alphabet. Another worked through long columns of arithmetic. Older students studied geography, grammar, or American history, while younger brothers and sisters carefully traced their first letters. The teacher became something like the conductor of a peaceful orchestra, guiding many different lessons without allowing the room to lose its gentle rhythm. The morning began with reading. From a small stack upon the teacher's desk came several copies of the famous McGuffey readers. Their leather binding showed years of careful use. Some pages had become slightly yellow with age. Others carried tiny fingerprints left behind by generations of students who had turned those same pages with quiet curiosity. Books were precious. Many rural schools owned only a limited number. Children often shared them, sitting shoulder to shoulder as they followed each sentence together. The youngest pupils gathered near the front of the room. Their small boots tapped softly against the wooden floor as they formed a neat semicircle. The teacher opened one reader and smiled warmly. Today's lesson told the simple story of a little bird building its nest among spring branches. The words were easy, gentle, perfect for beginning readers. One child carefully sounded out each word, sometimes slowly, sometimes confidently. Whenever someone stumbled, no laughter followed. Instead, older students quietly waited with encouraging smiles. Patience was one of the first lessons every child learned inside these walls. Reading was never a race. It was a journey. After several pages, the younger children returned to their desks. Now it was the older students' turn. A young girl of nearly 15 stood beside her desk holding another reader. Her voice carried calmly across the room as she read a passage describing distant mountain forests far beyond the familiar prairie. Many of the children listening had never seen a mountain. They knew wide grasslands, rolling hills, creeks winding between cottonwood trees. Yet through words alone, they could almost picture snow-covered peaks reaching into bright blue skies. Books quietly expanded the boundaries of their world. Nearby, the youngest pupils began another task. Each child placed a smooth black slate upon the desk. Instead of paper, many early exercises were completed with slate pencils. Mistakes disappeared with one simple wipe of a damp cloth. The teacher slowly walked between the rows. Tiny hands carefully copied the alphabet. A, B, C. Each letter grew steadier than the last. Some leaned slightly to one side. Others appeared wonderfully crooked. Yet every attempt represented progress. The teacher offered quiet encouragement. Very nice. Take your time. That line is much straighter. Simple words, spoken gently. They carried enormous weight. Across the room, another group had already begun arithmetic. Older boys and girls worked carefully through columns of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and long division written upon their slates. Mental calculation was encouraged whenever possible. Many farm children already understood numbers through everyday life. They counted eggs gathered each morning, measured grain, estimated harvests, calculated distances traveled by wagon. Arithmetic inside the classroom simply gave names and methods to skills they quietly practiced at home. One boy frowned thoughtfully at a difficult problem. Rather than immediately asking for help, he paused. He examined each number again. The teacher noticed but did not interrupt. Learning often happened during those quiet moments when children solved problems themselves. After another minute, the boy's face brightened ever so slightly. His answer had finally appeared. The teacher smiled from across the room. No words were necessary. Near the windows, a group of older students practiced penmanship. Small bottles of dark ink rested carefully upon their desks. Each student dipped a steel pen into the ink before slowly copying the sentence written upon the blackboard. Kindness makes every lesson easier. Every curve mattered. Every straight line required steady hands. Blotches occasionally appeared. So did tiny smudges where sleeves brushed across still wet letters. Nobody expected perfection. Beautiful handwriting developed slowly, just like good character. The teacher believed both required daily practice. Outside, sunlight climbed higher across the prairie. A gentle breeze carried the scent of drying corn stalks through a slightly opened window. Somewhere nearby, a meadowlark began singing once again. Its cheerful melody drifted softly into the classroom before disappearing among the distant fields. No one hurried to close the window. The sounds of nature belonged inside country schools almost as naturally as books themselves. The children listened for only a moment before quietly returning to their work. Learning and the natural world existed side by side. There was no sharp line separating one from the other. Soon the teacher reached toward a large rolled map hanging beside the blackboard. With practiced hands, it was carefully unfastened. The map slowly unfolded, revealing the growing United States. Many of the western territories still appeared vast and lightly settled. Railroads stretched like thin ribbons across enormous landscapes. Rivers wound toward distant oceans. The teacher traced one long blue line with the wooden pointer. The Mississippi River. Several older students nodded. Most had never seen it. Yet nearly every family had heard stories carried by travelers, merchants, or newspapers arriving through the local post office. The great river seemed almost magical, a place where enormous steamboats carried people and goods between distant towns. Places far beyond the quiet prairie where these children spent their days. Maps allowed imaginations to travel farther than wagons ever could. As the lesson continued, the schoolhouse settled once again into its familiar rhythm. Pages turned softly. Slate pencils whispered across smooth black surfaces. Pens scratched gently upon paper. The stove crackled with comforting warmth. Outside, the prairie breeze wandered patiently through fields of golden grass beneath an endless autumn sky. Inside the little one-room schoolhouse, ordinary lessons quietly shaped curious minds, proving that even the simplest classroom could open doors to a world far larger than the children could yet imagine. Morning recess on the prairie. By the time the geography lesson drew to a peaceful close, the sunlight had climbed well above the eastern horizon, filling the schoolhouse with a gentle warmth that made the room feel almost cozy, despite the crisp autumn air outside. The cast iron stove no longer crackled as eagerly as it had at dawn. Instead, it settled into a quiet rhythm, glowing softly while keeping the chill comfortably at bay. The teacher glanced toward the tall clock mounted above the blackboard. Its steady ticking had quietly measured every lesson of the morning. Without fanfare, the teacher closed the geography book and smiled. "I believe we've all earned a short recess." A ripple of excitement spread through the classroom, not loud or unruly, but bright enough to light every young face. Even the oldest students smiled. Books closed gently. Slate pencils were placed neatly beside black writing boards. Ink bottles received their corks once again. Every child understood the routine. Before anyone stepped outside, desks were left in order. Nothing was tossed carelessly. Nothing was forgotten. Good habits were considered part of every lesson. One by one, children gathered their coats from the wooden pegs near the back wall. Scarves were wrapped around small necks. Wool caps disappeared over tousled hair. Boots tapped softly across the polished floor as the classroom slowly emptied. The teacher opened the front door. Immediately, fresh prairie air flowed inside. It carried the comforting scent of dry grass, fallen leaves, distant wood smoke, and freshly turned earth where neighboring farmers had recently finished plowing. The children stepped outside almost instinctively, taking deep breaths. After spending the morning concentrating on books and lessons, the wide-open prairie felt wonderfully spacious. The schoolyard itself was beautifully simple. There were no colorful playgrounds, no metal swings, no climbing frames. Only open grass, a few sturdy shade trees, a split-rail fence, and endless countryside stretching toward every horizon. Yet to the children, it was more than enough. Imagination supplied everything else. Several boys immediately began a friendly game of tag, racing across the grass with laughter that carried lightly through the cool air. Their boots kicked up tiny clouds of golden leaves scattered by the previous night's breeze. Nearby, a group of girls skipped rope using one carefully braided length of hemp that had already served many seasons. Their laughter blended softly with the cheerful rhythm of the turning rope. Not far away, two younger children crouched beside a patch of clover, carefully examining a bright red ladybug making its slow journey across a fallen oak leaf. Neither child seemed in any hurry to disturb it. Simple discoveries often became the greatest adventures. The teacher remained on the porch for a few moments, watching quietly. Supervision in those days often looked different than it might today. Children were encouraged to solve small disagreements themselves, to include younger classmates in games, and to care for one another with quiet responsibility. Older students naturally kept watch over the youngest. No one had assigned them the task. It had simply become part of life. Soon the teacher walked slowly across the yard. A little boy proudly approached, carrying something cupped carefully inside both hands. "I found this." When he opened his fingers, a perfectly shaped acorn rested in his palm. Its smooth brown shell shone in the morning sunlight. The teacher admired it with genuine interest. "That's a fine one." The boy smiled as though he had discovered buried treasure. For a moment they talked about the great oak tree standing beside the schoolhouse, how every autumn it scattered hundreds of acorns, how tiny squirrels hurried to gather them before winter snow arrived, how one small seed could someday become another enormous tree. Lessons often continued even during recess. Nature quietly provided its own classroom. A gentle breeze stirred the branches overhead. Golden leaves drifted lazily toward the ground, spinning slowly through shafts of sunlight before settling softly upon the grass. Several children immediately began trying to catch the falling leaves before they touched the earth. Their cheerful game required nothing more than patience and quick hands. Laughter floated across the prairie like birdsong. Not every child joined the running games. Near the fence, two older girls sat together beneath the cottonwood tree, sharing stories while carefully mending a loose ribbon that had slipped from one bonnet. Another student opened a small book, choosing to spend part of recess reading beneath the warm autumn sun. The teacher noticed, but said nothing. Quiet moments were every bit as valuable as energetic ones. Beyond the fence, everyday farm life continued almost unchanged. A farmer guided a team of horses through a distant field. The steady scrape of the plow barely reached the schoolyard. Farther away, a flock of sheep grazed peacefully along a gentle hillside while an old sheepdog watched them with calm attention. From another direction came the rhythmic knocking of an axe splitting firewood for the approaching winter. The children heard these sounds so often that they rarely paused to notice them. They were simply part of the music of rural life. After several minutes, the teacher wandered toward the old hand pump beside the well. Several children had already gathered there. Each waited patiently for a turn to drink from the shared tin dipper. Fresh well water tasted cool and wonderfully refreshing after a busy morning of lessons. One older student carefully pumped the handle while another held the dipper beneath the clear stream. When the youngest children stepped forward, the older boys instinctively filled the cup for them first. Small acts of courtesy happened naturally. No one applauded them. They were simply expected. Nearby, a little girl carefully brushed dust from the hem of her younger brother's coat before buttoning it against the cool breeze. He thanked her with a shy smile. The teacher quietly observed these moments with quiet satisfaction. Books taught reading. Arithmetic taught numbers. But daily life among classmates quietly taught kindness, patience, generosity, and responsibility. Those lessons often lasted far longer than anything written upon the blackboard. The prairie sky above had become a brilliant shade of blue. White clouds drifted slowly overhead, casting soft shadows that wandered peacefully across fields ready for harvest. A flock of blackbirds suddenly lifted from a nearby cornfield, swirling together before settling once again a short distance away. Several children stopped running simply to watch them. Nature never seemed in a hurry. Perhaps people learned the same lesson by living close to it. After nearly 15 peaceful minutes, the teacher reached once more for the brass bell hanging beside the porch. Its familiar tone rang gently across the schoolyard. Almost immediately, games came to a natural end. Children gathered fallen hats. Lunch pails were straightened. Books were tucked safely beneath small arms. Without needing to be called twice, they formed an orderly line toward the schoolhouse door. Their cheeks glowed from the cool air. Their boots carried a little prairie dust. Their hearts felt lighter after time spent beneath the open sky. As each child stepped back into the warm classroom, the comforting scent of oak firewood welcomed them once again, and the little one-room schoolhouse quietly prepared to begin another peaceful chapter of learning together beneath the calm autumn sun. The midday meal and quiet conversations. The classroom settled into a calm rhythm once again after recess. Tiny boots left faint traces of prairie dust across the wooden floor, while rosy cheeks gradually lost the cool color the autumn breeze had painted upon them. One by one, the children returned to their desks. Books reopened. Slate pencils found familiar places in eager hands. The warm fire inside the cast-iron stove welcomed everyone back with its comforting crackle. Outside, the countryside remained peaceful. A gentle wind carried the scent of drying hay through the slightly opened window, mixing with the warm aroma of oak firewood and freshly sharpened cedar pencils. The teacher allowed the room a few quiet moments before beginning another lesson. Sometimes children learned best when given time simply to settle. The silence itself seemed to become part of the education. Soon the afternoon's final morning lesson focused on spelling. The teacher slowly pronounced each word while older students carefully copied them into small notebooks. Harvest, neighbor, lantern, journey. Each word belonged to the world the children already knew. Unlike many modern classrooms, lessons were often connected to everyday life. The words they practiced today might appear tomorrow in a family letter, a church bulletin, or a notice posted at the general store. Learning felt useful because it truly was. As the older children worked quietly, the youngest students gathered once more near the teacher's desk. This time, instead of reading, they listened to a simple story. It told of a small squirrel preparing for winter. The tale spoke gently about patience, careful planning, and helping others. The children listened with complete attention. Stories carried lessons far beyond reading. They quietly shaped character. Several older students smiled as they overheard the familiar tale. Though they had heard it years earlier, it still brought comforting memories of their own first days at school. Time moved differently inside the little schoolhouse. The youngest children slowly became the oldest. New students arrived each autumn. Others eventually left to help full-time on family farms or begin work in nearby towns. Yet the school itself remained, steady, faithful. Year after year, at last, the old wall clock announced noon with 12 gentle strikes. The teacher closed the final book of the morning. A warm smile spread across the room. Lunchtime. Immediately, the atmosphere relaxed. Children reached beneath their desks for carefully packed lunch pails, cloth bundles, and woven baskets prepared before sunrise by mothers, grandmothers, and older sisters. Every meal reflected the quiet resourcefulness of rural families. No two lunches looked exactly alike. One little girl unfolded a clean white cloth to reveal thick slices of homemade bread spread generously with fresh butter. Beside them rested a bright red apple gathered only the previous afternoon from the family orchard. Another child carried a small crock wrapped carefully in fabric. Inside waited hearty vegetable soup that had remained pleasantly warm beside the family stove before the morning journey to school. Nearby, two brothers shared slices of smoked ham tucked between coarse brown bread. Their mother had added a small piece of cheddar cheese and several pickled cucumbers preserved during the summer months. Simple food, wholesome food. Food prepared with care rather than convenience. One boy proudly opened his lunch pail to reveal 2 thick biscuits and a small jar of homemade blackberry jam. His classmates admired it with smiling eyes. Blackberries had grown especially well that summer. Across the room, Another child carefully peeled a hard-boiled egg while quietly offering one half to his younger sister. She accepted with a grateful smile. Sharing came naturally, not because anyone demanded it, because most children understood that generosity often returned when least expected. The teacher's own meal was equally modest: a sandwich wrapped neatly in waxed paper, a small pear, a handful of roasted walnuts gathered during an autumn walk, and a tin cup waiting to be filled with cool water from the well. There was no separate dining room. Teacher and students shared the same space. The classroom, only moments earlier devoted to arithmetic and reading, now transformed into a peaceful gathering place where conversation replaced recitation. Children spoke softly among themselves. No one shouted. No one hurried. Many families had taught table manners long before children entered school. The teacher listened with quiet amusement as small conversations drifted gently through the room. "My father says we'll finish harvesting by next week. Our calf finally learned to follow its mother. My grandmother is making apple butter tomorrow. We saw wild geese flying south yesterday evening." These ordinary conversations painted a living picture of rural America in 1885. The seasons shaped every family. The weather influenced nearly every plan. Life moved according to nature's quiet calendar. After finishing their meals, several children carefully folded lunch cloths while others polished shiny apples until every bite disappeared. Nothing was wasted. Crumbs were gathered. Containers closed neatly. Even the smallest piece of bread held value. Food required long hours of labor before reaching the family table. The teacher often noticed these quiet habits with quiet appreciation. Respect for simple things was woven deeply into everyday life. Outside, the autumn sun rested high above the prairie. Its warm light shimmered across fields where farmers continued working without pause. From the classroom windows, children could occasionally glimpse distant wagons moving slowly along dusty roads. A flock of white clouds drifted lazily overhead, their broad shadows wandering across harvested fields like silent travelers. One little boy finished eating earlier than the others and wandered quietly toward the classroom bookshelf. He carefully selected a book filled with woodcut illustrations of American birds. Without making a sound, he sat beside the window and slowly turned each page. A blue jay, a meadowlark, a red-tailed hawk. Each picture reminded him of birds he had often seen while helping his father repair fences. Books and real life blended together so naturally that one seemed to deepen the other. Nearby, two girls quietly braided one another's hair while talking softly about the upcoming Thanksgiving gathering their families would soon celebrate. Another pair of brothers carefully polished muddy boots with an old cloth before placing them neatly beneath their desks once more. The teacher watched these peaceful scenes with quiet gratitude. No formal lesson had been planned for lunchtime, yet children continued learning all the same. They practiced kindness, conversation, patience, responsibility, community. Some of life's most valuable lessons were never written upon the blackboard. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the colorful leaves of the great oak tree beside the schoolhouse. Several leaves drifted slowly past the windows, dancing through bright afternoon sunlight before coming gently to rest upon the grass below. Inside, the little one-room schoolhouse felt warm, welcoming, and wonderfully alive. Not because of grand events, but because of countless small moments shared by ordinary people whose quiet lives would one day become part of America's forgotten history. The teacher glanced once more toward the old clock. The lunch hour was nearly over. Soon the afternoon lessons would begin, carrying the children gently toward another peaceful chapter in their day beneath the endless prairie sky. An afternoon of maps, music, and quiet wonder. The last crumbs of lunch disappeared into neatly folded cloths, and the final lunch pails found their familiar places beneath the wooden desks. One by one, the children settled back into their seats. The lively conversations that had filled the room only moments before slowly faded, replaced once again by the peaceful sounds that belonged to the little schoolhouse. A page turned. A chair shifted softly across the floor. The cast iron stove gave a gentle pop as another piece of oak settled into glowing embers. Outside, the afternoon breeze continued its patient journey across the prairie, rustling the dry grasses until they shimmered like gentle waves beneath the bright October sun. The teacher waited quietly until every child had become still. There was never any need to raise a voice. The children understood the rhythm of the day as naturally as the changing seasons. When the room had grown calm once more, the teacher walked toward a large wooden cabinet standing beside the blackboard. From inside, a carefully rolled map was lifted with both hands. The older students immediately smiled. Map lessons were among everyone's favorites. The teacher slowly unfastened the worn leather strap holding the map together. With a soft rustling sound, it unfurled across the front wall. Its colors had faded after years of faithful service, yet rivers, mountains, states, and territories could still be seen clearly. Many small hands rested eagerly upon desktops. Some children had never traveled farther than the neighboring county. Others had visited a nearby town only once or twice each year. Yet every lesson upon this map allowed them to journey much farther, without leaving their seats. The teacher lifted a smooth wooden pointer. Its polished surface reflected the afternoon light as it moved gently toward the eastern side of the country. "This," the teacher said softly, "is where the Atlantic Ocean meets the American coast." Several younger children leaned forward with wide eyes. An ocean seemed almost impossible to imagine, water stretching farther than anyone could see. No fences, no fields, no winding dirt roads, only waves meeting the horizon. One little girl whispered almost to herself, "It must be beautiful." The teacher smiled. "I believe it is." Then the pointer slowly traveled westward, across broad rivers, rolling hills, growing cities, wide forests, until finally it rested upon the enormous western territories where mountains rose higher than clouds. Each place carried its own stories, its own people, its own ordinary lives waiting to be discovered. The lesson never became a list of facts. Instead, it became a quiet journey. Children imagined fishermen mending nets beside distant harbors, lumbermen working beneath towering pine trees, miners living among rugged mountains, families crossing endless plains inside covered wagons. Every location held ordinary people whose daily lives quietly shaped the nation. After geography came, perhaps the most anticipated part of many afternoons: music. The teacher reached beneath the desk and carefully lifted a small tuning fork. With one gentle tap against the wooden edge of the table, a clear silver note floated through the classroom. The room became perfectly still. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that music deserved quiet attention. The teacher gave the opening pitch. Together, 23 young voices rose gently into the warm afternoon air. Their song was simple, unhurried, filled with gratitude for the changing seasons and the quiet beauty of God's creation. No child sang perfectly. Some voices wandered slightly above the melody. Others remained softly below. Yet together they formed something wonderfully comforting. The music drifted through the open windows and out across the prairie. Perhaps a passing farmer heard it while repairing a fence. Perhaps a woman hanging laundry paused for only a moment to listen. Perhaps only the meadowlarks answered from the nearby field. Whatever the case, the little schoolhouse seemed somehow even more peaceful while the children sang. When the final note faded, silence returned naturally. No applause followed. Music had not been performed. It had simply been shared. The teacher thanked the children with a warm nod before opening another book. This one contained several short poems poetry occupied a gentle place within 19th century classrooms. Its steady rhythm strengthened memory. Its beautiful language encouraged careful speaking. Its peaceful imagery often reflected the natural world surrounding the children every day. One older student stood beside his desk and slowly recited a short verse about autumn leaves drifting quietly through woodland paths. His voice remained calm and thoughtful. When he finished, the classroom rested in silence for a brief moment before the teacher offered quiet praise. Well spoken. Another student followed with a poem describing birds preparing for winter migration. Several younger children glanced automatically toward the classroom windows, almost expecting to see geese crossing the bright blue sky. Outside, a pair of crows flew slowly above the distant cornfields. Nature seemed determined to accompany every lesson. Later that afternoon, the teacher introduced something a little different. From a small wooden box came several curious objects collected over many years. A smooth piece of polished quartz found beside a nearby creek, a feather from a wild turkey, an unusually shaped acorn, a dried milkweed pod still holding its silky white fibers. The children passed each object carefully from one desk to another. Tiny fingers explored rough bark, smooth stone, delicate feathers, and soft seed fibers. Learning was never limited to books alone. The natural world remained one of their greatest teachers. The teacher encouraged careful observation rather than quick answers. "What do you notice? How does it feel? Where do you think it came from?" The children answered thoughtfully. No one hurried. Curiosity unfolded at its own peaceful pace. As the afternoon continued, warm sunlight slowly shifted across the room. The golden beams that had rested near the front desks now stretched gently toward the back wall. Dust motes floated lazily through the light like tiny stars suspended in still air. Outside, long shadows began forming beneath the great oak tree. The day was quietly preparing for evening, though there was still much to enjoy before the final bell would ring. Inside the little one-room schoolhouse, 23 children continued discovering the world, not through excitement or haste, but through patient observation, gentle guidance, and the quiet joy of learning together. The teacher glanced toward the old clock once more. Only one final lesson remained before the school day would draw peacefully to its close, and like every lesson before it, it would become another small thread woven into memories these children would carry for the rest of their lives. The final lesson and the journey home. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. Its warm golden light entered the schoolhouse at a different angle now, stretching long bands of sunshine across the worn wooden floor. The bright morning glow had softened into something quieter, gentler, the kind of light that seemed to invite slower thoughts. Outside, the prairie carried on with its peaceful rhythm. A light breeze stirred the tall grasses beyond the split-rail fence, sending gentle waves across the fields like ripples moving over a quiet lake. Somewhere in the distance, a wagon wheel creaked steadily along the dusty road. Closer still, a meadowlark offered one last cheerful song before settling among the autumn weeds. Inside the classroom, the children remained wonderfully attentive. The teacher stood beside the blackboard, smoothing the sleeve of a modest gray dress before writing the final lesson of the day. In careful white letters appeared a familiar sentence: "Honesty and kindness are treasures no one can take away." The words were simple. Every child could understand them. Yet they carried wisdom that many would remember long after multiplication tables and spelling lists had faded from memory. The teacher stepped aside. "Let's read it together." 23 young voices filled the room, slowly, clearly, almost like a quiet promise. The sentence echoed gently against the pine walls before settling into silence once again. Lessons inside an 1880s country school were never meant to shape only the mind. They were meant to shape the heart as well. Teachers believed that reading, arithmetic, and geography mattered greatly. but honesty, respect, patience, hard work, compassion. These were the qualities that built strong families and dependable neighbors. Many of the children would never attend college. Some would leave school within only a few years to help on family farms. Others might apprentice as blacksmiths, carpenters, merchants, or seamstresses. Yet wherever life carried them, these quiet values would remain close companions. The teacher invited each older student to stand and share one thing they had learned during the day. A tall boy near the back smiled thoughtfully. "I learned that the Mississippi River carries boats farther than I imagined." A girl beside the window quietly added, "I never knew mountains could keep snow even during summer." Another child grinned shyly. "I finally understand long division." Soft laughter warmed the room. Even the teacher smiled. Sometimes the smallest victories felt like the greatest ones. The younger children answered more simply, "I learned to write my G. I can spell harvest now. I remembered every word of the squirrel story." Every answer received the same warm encouragement. Learning was celebrated without comparison. No child needed to be the smartest, only willing to keep growing. The teacher then reached into a small wooden basket resting beneath the desk. Inside lay several carefully collected oak leaves in shades of amber, copper, and deep crimson. Each leaf was different. Some were broad and perfectly shaped. Others carried tiny marks left by insects during the summer months. The teacher handed one leaf to every student. "Take this home." The children accepted them carefully, almost as though each leaf were something precious. "It reminds us," the teacher explained gently, "that every season has its own beauty." Tiny fingers explored the delicate veins running through the dry leaves. Many children tucked them safely inside readers or copybooks so they would not become bent during the journey home. Years later, some might even discover those forgotten leaves still resting between old pages, a quiet memory preserved by autumn itself. Outside, long shadows stretched farther across the schoolyard. The great oak beside the building now painted broad patterns upon the grass. Its branches swayed gently against a brilliant blue sky that slowly hinted at evening. The teacher looked once toward the old wall clock. Only a few minutes remained. No one seemed eager to rush away. There was comfort inside the little schoolhouse. Its familiar walls had become almost like a second home. For many children, it was the one place where neighbors from miles around gathered every weekday throughout the school year. Friendships had grown here. Confidence had grown here. Dreams had quietly taken root here. The teacher slowly closed the final book. Then came the moment every child recognized. Reaching toward the polished brass handbell resting upon the desk, the teacher lifted it gently. Its wooden handle felt smooth after years of faithful use. With one calm movement, the bell rang. Its clear tone floated through the classroom, out the open windows, across the schoolyard, into the peaceful prairie beyond. The school day had ended. Almost immediately, children began gathering their belongings. Slate boards were wiped clean one final time. Books disappeared into cloth satchels. Pencils returned to carefully stitched pockets. Lunch pails found waiting hands once again. The room filled with the pleasant sounds of quiet preparation. No frantic rushing, no loud shouting. Simply the familiar rhythm of another ordinary day drawing peacefully to its close. Before anyone stepped outside, every student paused beside the teacher. Some offered a cheerful, "Good afternoon, miss." Others smiled shyly before pulling on wool coats and mittens. The teacher answered every farewell with the same gentle kindness. "Travel safely. Tell your mother I hope she's feeling better. I'll see you tomorrow." Those small conversations strengthened the bond between school and home. Teachers often knew every family personally. They celebrated new babies, worried during illnesses, and quietly shared in both hardships and harvest celebrations. The little schoolhouse stood at the heart of the community. When the last child finally stepped through the doorway, the schoolyard slowly came alive once again. Brothers and sisters walked together toward distant farms. Older boys helped younger children climb into waiting wagons. Several fathers tipped their hats respectfully toward the teacher before guiding horse teams back onto the narrow country road. One little girl skipped happily beside her older sister, clutching the colorful oak leaf she had received only moments before. The afternoon sun bathed everything in warm amber light. Dust rose softly beneath wagon wheels before settling once more upon the familiar road. The sounds of cheerful conversation gradually grew quieter as families disappeared beyond gentle hills and rows of golden corn. The teacher remained standing on the porch for a few peaceful moments, watching, smiling, listening. Soon only the wind remained. It whispered through the prairie grasses exactly as it had before sunrise. The schoolyard became wonderfully still once again. Another ordinary day had quietly become another cherished memory. And tomorrow morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the little white schoolhouse once more, the bell would ring again, welcoming another generation of curious young minds ready to begin another peaceful journey of learning beneath the endless American sky. After the bell, the teacher's quiet evening, the last wagon disappeared beyond a gentle rise in the road, and with it went the cheerful voices that had filled the little schoolyard throughout the day. Silence returned so gradually that it hardly seemed to arrive at all. The prairie simply reclaimed its familiar place. The teacher remained standing on the weathered wooden porch for another moment, one hand resting lightly upon the porch railing still warm from the afternoon sun. A cool autumn breeze wandered across the open fields, carrying the earthy scent of harvested corn, dry grasses, and distant wood smoke rising from farmhouse chimneys where evening meals were already beginning to simmer. The schoolhouse, so full of life only moments before, now seemed to breathe more slowly. Its empty windows reflected the broad blue sky. The split-rail fence cast long shadows across the quiet yard. Somewhere beneath the great oak tree, a single forgotten jump rope rested upon the grass. The teacher walked over, gently picked it up, brushed away a few dry leaves, and carried it back inside. Nothing was ever left carelessly behind. Everything had its place. Stepping once more into the classroom, the teacher closed the heavy wooden door with quiet care. The familiar room felt wonderfully peaceful. Rows of empty desks stood patiently beneath the afternoon light. The blackboard still carried the day's final sentence. Honesty and kindness are treasures no one can take away. For a brief moment, the teacher simply looked at those words. How many children had read them today? 23. How many would still remember them years from now? Perhaps only a few. Yet even if only one child carried those words into adulthood, the lesson had been worthwhile. Teaching rarely offered immediate rewards. Its greatest harvest often appeared many years later. The teacher reached for the felt eraser and slowly wiped the blackboard clean. White chalk dust drifted softly through beams of golden sunlight before settling almost invisibly upon the floorboards. Tomorrow would bring new words, new arithmetic problems, new stories. Each day quietly made room for the next. Nearby, the students' copybooks remained stacked neatly upon a corner shelf. The teacher opened several of them one by one, carefully written letters, steadily improving handwriting, thoughtful spelling exercises, a few tiny mistakes here and there. Nothing unusual. Each page told its own quiet story of steady progress. One notebook belonged to the youngest girl in class. Only weeks earlier she had struggled to write even the simplest letters. Now she had filled an entire page with careful sentences. The letters leaned slightly to one side, but each word reflected growing confidence. The teacher smiled. Progress seldom arrived all at once. It appeared quietly, one lesson at a time, one page at a time. Across the room, Another copybook belonged to the oldest boy. His handwriting had become strong and remarkably neat. Soon he would likely leave school to help manage more of the family farm. His classroom days were becoming fewer, yet the teacher hoped he would always continue reading, continue learning. Education did not truly end when a student left the schoolhouse. It simply found new places to grow. The teacher gathered several worn textbooks needing small repairs. One loose page was carefully stitched back into place using needle and thread kept inside a small wooden sewing box. Books were valuable. Many had already served generations of students. Replacing them was neither simple nor inexpensive. Preserving them became another quiet responsibility. The cast iron stove had begun cooling now. Its lively fire had settled into glowing embers that painted the room with a gentle warmth. The teacher added one final small piece of oak, not for the students this time, but simply to keep the room dry during the cool autumn evening. Outside, the sunlight slowly deepened into rich shades of amber. Long shadows stretched farther across the prairie. The teacher stepped toward one of the tall windows. Beyond the schoolyard, farmers guided wagons homeward after another full day in the fields. A small flock of sheep followed a narrow path toward their pasture. Smoke drifted peacefully above scattered farmhouses, curling into the still evening air. Every family would soon gather around supper tables remarkably similar to those described during today's lessons. Warm bread, simple stew, fresh butter, quiet conversation. Perhaps one or two children would tell their parents about the geography map. Others might proudly demonstrate a newly learned spelling word. Some would carefully show the colorful oak leaf now tucked safely inside a reader. The teacher liked imagining those small moments. A lesson never truly ended when the bell rang. It traveled home with every child. Perhaps that was the true purpose of education. Not simply filling minds with facts, but quietly becoming part of everyday family life. The teacher turned from the window and reached for the attendance ledger resting upon the desk. Its leather cover had become smooth after years of faithful use. Today's names were already marked, every child present. A fortunate day. Winter sometimes made attendance uncertain. Heavy snow, flooded creeks, illness, broken wagon wheels. Many things could keep children from school. On pleasant autumn days like this one, the classroom felt wonderfully complete. Closing the ledger gently, the teacher slipped it into the desk drawer. Then came one final task before leaving. The room itself deserved careful attention. Windows were lowered just enough to allow fresh air during the cool evening. Desks were straightened. The ink bottles were gathered safely together. Fresh chalk was placed neatly beside tomorrow's lesson book. Nothing dramatic, nothing hurried, only dozens of tiny acts of preparation. Teaching extended far beyond the hours children occupied their desks. It was found in every quiet detail. The teacher finally reached for a wool coat hanging near the doorway. Its familiar fabric carried the faint scent of cedar from the small wardrobe at home. A knitted scarf was wrapped gently around the neck. Leather gloves slipped comfortably over tired hands. Before leaving, the teacher paused one final time inside the now empty classroom. Golden evening light rested softly across every desk. The little room seemed almost grateful for its peaceful silence after a busy day of learning. Tomorrow morning, before sunrise, the teacher would return once again. The stove would be lit. The chalk would write fresh lessons. The bell would ring across the prairie. And 23 curious children would once again fill this humble one-room schoolhouse with quiet hope, gentle laughter, and the timeless joy of learning. The teacher smiled softly, extinguished the lantern near the desk, and stepped outside into the cool autumn evening, where the first hints of twilight were already settling gently over the endless American prairie. A quiet autumn evening and the promise of tomorrow. The schoolhouse door closed gently behind the teacher with a soft wooden click. For a brief moment, Everything stood perfectly still. The little white building rested quietly beneath the broad October sky, its windows glowing warmly as the last rays of afternoon sunlight reflected from the old glass. Soon even that golden light would fade. Evening was arriving with its familiar gentleness. The teacher stepped carefully down the worn wooden steps, each one polished smooth by countless years of small boots and steady footsteps. The narrow path leading away from the schoolhouse had become lined with fallen oak leaves. They whispered softly beneath sturdy leather shoes. No two leaves carried exactly the same shade. Some glowed bright amber, others burned with deep crimson. Many had already faded into gentle browns that blended naturally with the prairie earth. The autumn landscape seemed almost painted by patient hands. Far across the fields, the sky slowly transformed into layers of warm gold, pale peach, soft lavender, and the deepest blue waiting quietly above. Long shadows stretched across harvested farmland where neat rows of corn stubble caught the evening light. Fence posts stood like silent guardians watching another peaceful day come to its close. The teacher began the familiar walk toward home. There was no hurry. There rarely was. Most country roads in 1885 invited slow travel. A hurried traveler noticed only the destination. A slower traveler discovered the world along the way. The road curved gently beside a narrow creek where clear water moved patiently over smooth stones. Golden leaves floated upon its quiet surface before continuing downstream toward places neither the teacher nor the children had ever seen. The soft sound of flowing water blended beautifully with distant birdsong. Nature itself seemed to whisper good night. A pair of white-tailed deer emerged cautiously from the edge of a nearby grove. Their ears twitched gently as they watched the lone traveler for only a moment. Finding no reason for concern, they returned peacefully to grazing among the tall grasses. Wildlife remained an ordinary companion in rural America. Children often recognized animal tracks almost as easily as letters in their readers. A little farther along the road, an elderly farmer paused beside a wooden gate while gathering his small herd of dairy cows for evening milking. He removed his broad-brimmed hat with a warm smile. "Good evening, miss. Good evening, Mr. Carter. How are the children today?" "They worked hard." The farmer smiled with quiet satisfaction. "That's good to hear. Nothing more needed saying." In small farming communities, everyone understood the importance of the little schoolhouse. Parents entrusted teachers not only with books and lessons, but with helping shape the next generation of neighbors. As the teacher continued walking, delicious aromas began drifting gently across the countryside. Fresh bread baking inside cast-iron ovens, wood smoke curling upward from stone chimneys, roasted potatoes, chicken stew, apple pie cooling upon open windowsills. Each farmhouse contributed its own comforting scent to the cool evening air. The entire valley seemed wrapped in the fragrance of supper. Smoke rose lazily into the calm sky, where the first hints of twilight had begun to soften the horizon. One farmhouse stood beside a small apple orchard whose branches still carried a few late-season fruits. Several children laughed as they helped gather the remaining apples into sturdy wooden baskets. Their father lifted the heaviest basket onto a waiting wagon while their mother spread clean cloths across the porch to begin sorting fruit for cider and preserves. The teacher smiled while passing. Several familiar faces waved enthusiastically. "See you tomorrow, miss! I'll be there early! I finished my spelling words!" The cheerful promises warmed the teacher's heart. Those simple exchanges revealed something quietly beautiful. School had become more than a building. It had become a shared part of everyday life. Soon the road crossed a modest wooden bridge spanning the little creek. The teacher paused halfway across. The flowing water reflected the evening sky like polished glass. Golden clouds drifted upon its surface. A kingfisher darted low above the stream before disappearing among willow branches downstream. Nearby, Frogs had already begun their gentle evening chorus. The sounds blended together into a peaceful melody that no orchestra could ever truly imitate. For several quiet moments, there was nothing to accomplish, nothing to organize, nothing to teach. Only the simple joy of standing beneath an endless autumn sky while another beautiful day slowly became a memory. The teacher breathed deeply. Cool air carried the rich scent of damp earth, fallen leaves, cedar trees, and distant fireplaces. Autumn possessed a fragrance entirely its own, one that spoke softly of harvests completed, blankets soon to be unpacked, long evenings beside warm fires, books waiting to be read beneath lamplight. As twilight deepened, stars gradually appeared above the prairie. First one, then another. Soon dozens shimmered across the heavens with quiet confidence. Far from busy cities, the night sky revealed extraordinary beauty. Children growing up here learned constellations almost as naturally as multiplication tables. Many evenings they stood beside parents after supper, pointing toward familiar patterns overhead while listening to family stories passed gently from one generation to the next. The teacher finally reached the small white cottage that had become home several years earlier. Its windows glowed warmly with welcoming lantern light. A tidy garden rested peacefully beside the front porch, now mostly sleeping beneath autumn's cool embrace. Only a few late chrysanthemums still bloomed, adding touches of yellow and bronze against the fading green. Opening the front gate, the teacher paused once more to look back toward the distant prairie. Though the schoolhouse could no longer be seen beyond gentle hills and scattered trees, its presence still seemed close. 23 young minds, 23 growing hearts, 23 ordinary children whose futures remained wonderfully unwritten. Perhaps one would become a doctor serving rural families. Another might teach inside that very same schoolhouse. Some would inherit farms built through generations of patient labor. Others might travel westward, seeking new opportunities across America's expanding frontier. No one could know. Yet every lesson shared within that humble classroom would quietly accompany them wherever life eventually led. Inside the cottage, a small oil lamp glowed upon the kitchen table beside an open Bible, a favorite novel, and tomorrow's lesson book waiting patiently to be prepared. The teacher removed a wool coat, placed it neatly upon a wooden hook, and smiled softly. Another peaceful day had come to its gentle conclusion. Outside, crickets sang beneath a sky filled with countless stars. Inside, the warmth of home offered quiet comfort. And somewhere beyond the rolling prairie, 23 children were settling into their own beds, carrying with them fresh memories of maps, music, stories, laughter, and kindness from another ordinary school day in the autumn of 1885. Tomorrow, with the first light of dawn, the school bell would ring once again, and the peaceful rhythm of learning would begin anew. Winter arrives at the little schoolhouse. Several quiet weeks slipped by, almost unnoticed, as autumn gradually gave way to winter. The brilliant reds and golds of October slowly disappeared from the prairie. One crisp morning, the children awoke to discover that the fields no longer shimmered with tall grasses, but rested beneath a delicate blanket of frost. Every fence rail sparkled in the first light of dawn. Each bare tree branch seemed covered with tiny crystals that caught the sunrise like countless little stars. The air itself felt wonderfully different, cleaner, sharper. Every breath carried the cool freshness that only an American winter morning could bring. Long before daylight reached the eastern horizon, the teacher had already risen from bed. The small cottage remained comfortably warm beneath thick handmade quilts, but stepping onto the wooden floor reminded every traveler that winter had truly arrived. The room felt pleasantly cool. The windows carried delicate patterns of frost, so beautiful they almost resembled tiny forests painted upon the glass. Each design was unique. Nature never repeated itself. The teacher wrapped a thick wool shawl around tired shoulders before striking a match. Within moments, dry kindling inside the iron stove crackled cheerfully to life. Soon the familiar scent of burning oak filled the little cottage, bringing warmth that slowly spread from room to room. A simple breakfast waited nearby. Fresh biscuits baked the previous evening, homemade apple butter, a small bowl of oatmeal sweetened with a little maple syrup. Alongside it rested a steaming cup of coffee whose comforting aroma blended beautifully with the fragrance of wood smoke. Outside, darkness still covered the countryside. Only a few farmhouse windows glowed softly across the distant prairie. Other families were beginning their own quiet mornings. Farm animals still required care no matter how cold the weather became. Cows needed milking. Horses required fresh hay. Chickens waited patiently inside warm coops. Winter changed many things. Responsibility was not one of them. After breakfast, the teacher dressed carefully for the journey. Several warm layers became necessary now. A heavy wool dress, a thick knitted sweater, a long winter coat reaching nearly to the ankles, a hand-woven scarf wrapped snugly around the neck, leather boots carefully polished against melting snow, soft wool gloves. Finally, a warm bonnet tied securely beneath the chin. Every piece of clothing served a purpose. Comfort depended upon thoughtful preparation. Before leaving, tomorrow's arithmetic papers and reading books were tucked carefully inside a sturdy leather satchel. The teacher lifted a small lantern from its hook beside the doorway. Its steady flame cast a gentle golden circle upon the snowy path outside. The prairie seemed almost magical beneath the early morning darkness. Fresh snow had fallen quietly during the night. Not a single wagon track disturbed its smooth white surface. Every field stretched peacefully toward the horizon like a soft blanket resting beneath countless stars. Only the footprints of rabbits and foxes crossed the untouched snow. Tiny stories written silently during the night. The teacher smiled while noticing them. Children would certainly discover those tracks later today. Perhaps they would spend recess guessing which animals had wandered past the schoolhouse before sunrise. The narrow country road felt wonderfully peaceful. Each step produced a gentle crunch beneath sturdy boots. The sound echoed softly through the still morning air. Nearby, cedar trees carried heavy coats of fresh snow upon every branch. Now and then, a light breeze shook loose tiny clouds of sparkling powder that drifted gracefully toward the ground. The eastern sky slowly brightened. Deep navy blue softened into pale violet. Then came delicate shades of pink and gold. Sunrise during winter never seemed hurried. Instead, daylight unfolded quietly across the landscape, as though the world itself wished to wake gently. Soon another traveler appeared farther down the road. Old Mr. Harris guided a sturdy bay horse pulling a sled loaded with neatly stacked firewood. Replacing wagon wheels with wooden runners made travel easier once snow covered the roads. He tipped his fur cap with a broad smile. "Cold enough for you this morning?" The teacher laughed softly. "It certainly reminds us that December has arrived." Mr. Harris nodded toward the sled. "Taking extra firewood to the church after this. Folks will need plenty before Sunday's service. Communities depended upon neighbors during winter, sharing firewood, helping clear roads, checking on elderly families after heavy snowstorms. Acts of kindness became as ordinary as snowfall itself. After wishing one another a pleasant day, they continued along their separate paths. The teacher reached the schoolhouse while dawn still rested low upon the horizon. Its white walls blended almost perfectly with the surrounding snow. Only the dark roof and brick chimney stood clearly against the bright landscape. Unlocking the front door, the teacher stepped inside. The classroom greeted its first visitor with quiet stillness. The room had grown quite cold overnight. Breaths appeared as tiny clouds in the morning air. The teacher wasted no time. Dry oak logs were carefully arranged inside the cast iron stove. A handful of pine kindling nestled beneath them. Another match struck gently against the box. Within moments, cheerful flames danced among the wood. The familiar crackling sound filled the empty room. Slowly, patiently, warmth returned. While the stove worked quietly, the teacher prepared everything else. Fresh chalk rested beside the blackboard. Readers were stacked neatly upon the front desk. Ink bottles inspected. Maps rolled carefully into place. The attendance ledger opened to a fresh page. Outside, the first children began appearing one by one across the snowy fields. Some walked with brothers and sisters bundled inside oversized wool scarves. Others arrived in horse-drawn sleighs whose polished runners whispered softly across packed snow. Bright red cheeks, rosy noses, clouds of laughter drifting through the cold morning air. Many children carried small pieces of firewood tucked beneath their arms. It had become an unspoken tradition. Each family contributed a little whenever possible, helping keep the schoolhouse warm throughout the long winter months. The teacher watched from the doorway with quiet gratitude. Education here belonged to everyone. Parents, children, neighbors. The entire community helped sustain the little schoolhouse. One by one, boots stamped gently upon the porch to shake away fresh snow. Mittens were hung carefully beside the door. Scarves loosened. Coats placed neatly upon wooden pegs. Soon the classroom filled with familiar smiles once again. The cast iron stove glowed warmly at the center of the room, welcoming every child with comforting heat after the chilly journey. Outside, snowflakes began drifting gently from the pale gray sky once more. Inside, 23 eager students gathered around their desks, ready to begin another peaceful day of learning. Winter had arrived upon the American prairie. Yet within the humble walls of the little one-room schoolhouse, warmth came not only from the glowing stove, but from shared kindness, quiet curiosity, and the enduring joy of learning together. Beneath the moonlit prairie, a lasting legacy. Winter settled gently across the prairie, and before long the little one-room schoolhouse became part of a landscape painted almost entirely in white. Snow rested upon the roof in soft rounded layers. Icicles sparkled beneath the eaves whenever the pale winter sun climbed above the horizon. The split-rail fence disappeared beneath gentle drifts, while familiar wagon paths became smooth ribbons stretching across the countryside. Yet every weekday morning, just as faithfully as before, tiny footprints appeared once again, one after another, crossing snowy fields, following frozen creeks, leading quietly toward the little white schoolhouse. The teacher always noticed them before the children arrived, standing beside the classroom window while the stove slowly warmed the room. Those fresh tracks became the first lesson of every morning. They spoke of determination, of families who believed learning remained worthwhile, even when the journey meant walking through snow before sunrise. Soon the familiar sounds returned, the cheerful crunch of boots, the soft jingling of horse harnesses, laughter carried upon crisp winter air, the gentle thump of lunch pails being placed beneath wooden desks. Within only a few minutes, the quiet building came alive once again. The windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Coats lined the pegs beside the doorway. Wet mittens rested carefully near the stove to dry before afternoon. The room carried its familiar winter fragrance: oak firewood, warm wool, fresh pine kindling, a hint of chalk dust, leather-bound books that had already passed through countless young hands. It was a scent impossible to purchase. It belonged entirely to the schoolhouse. The lessons continued through every changing season. Some mornings were devoted to history, others to arithmetic or geography. The youngest children patiently practiced forming neat letters. Older students read speeches, poems, newspaper articles, and passages from well-loved readers whose pages had become soft from years of careful use. Sometimes snow fell so heavily that the world outside nearly disappeared. Large white flakes drifted silently past the tall windows until the prairie looked almost dreamlike. On such afternoons, the classroom grew especially cozy. The crackling stove offered steady warmth while every child leaned quietly over books or slates. No one seemed eager for the day to end. Outside, winter ruled the fields. Inside, learning quietly carried on. Now and then the teacher paused to look around the room. Each face represented a different future. One little boy loved numbers more than anything else. Perhaps one day he would become an accountant or banker in a growing American town. A thoughtful girl who filled every margin of her notebook with careful drawings might someday teach children of her own. Another student, fascinated by maps and rivers, often dreamed aloud about traveling west or perhaps sailing upon the Great Lakes. No one could truly know where their journeys would lead, but the seeds of those futures were already taking root within this simple wooden room. Education did not promise wealth. It did not guarantee an easy life. What it offered was something quieter, the ability to read a letter from a distant loved one, to keep careful records of a family farm, to understand a newspaper describing events beyond the prairie, to write stories, to solve problems, to teach others. Those gifts would remain long after childhood itself had quietly passed. As Christmas approached, the children prepared a small celebration. There were no elaborate decorations, no electric lights, no expensive gifts. Instead, evergreen branches gathered from nearby cedar trees decorated the front of the classroom. Simple paper snowflakes, carefully folded by patient hands, hung inside the windows. The older students practiced familiar hymns while the younger children memorized short poems to recite before parents. One mother baked ginger cookies. Another family contributed jars of preserved apples. Someone brought popcorn to string into long garlands. Even the smallest offering became part of something larger. The schoolhouse once again reminded everyone that a community was built through shared kindness rather than grand displays. On the evening of the Christmas gathering, lanterns glowed warmly inside every window. Families arrived by sleigh beneath a sky bright with countless stars. The little classroom that usually held only 23 students now welcomed grandparents, younger brothers and sisters, neighbors, and old friends. Laughter filled every corner. Songs echoed gently from the wooden walls. Children proudly recited poems they had practiced for weeks. The teacher watched quietly from the side of the room. There was deep satisfaction in seeing nervous smiles become confident voices. No applause was loud. No celebration was extravagant. Everything remained wonderfully simple. Yet many who attended would remember that evening for the rest of their lives. Winter slowly gave way to spring. Snow melted into winding creeks. The prairie awakened once again beneath fresh green grass and tiny wildflowers. Birdsong returned before sunrise. The great oak outside the schoolhouse produced new leaves that shimmered gently in the morning breeze. Another season had quietly completed its circle. Another year of learning drew toward its close. On the final afternoon before summer vacation, the children gathered outside beneath the spreading branches of the old oak tree. Its shade had sheltered games, conversations, and quiet moments of reflection throughout the year. The teacher held the familiar brass handbell one last time before the long summer break. The children stood together, hats in hand, faces glowing beneath the warm June sunshine. "There will always be more books to read," the teacher said softly. "There will always be more things to discover." The children listened with the same careful attention they had shown on the very first day. Never stop asking questions. Never stop learning. And always remember that kindness is one lesson no one ever truly graduates from. Several children nodded quietly. Others smiled. A few blinked back, unexpected tears. The bell rang gently across the prairie. Its clear voice drifted over fields of waving grass, across winding creeks, and toward distant farmhouses where another peaceful summer was about to begin. Years would pass. The children would grow older. Some would remain nearby. Others would travel far beyond the horizon. The prairie itself would slowly change. Railroads would expand. Automobiles would eventually replace many horse-drawn wagons. Electric lights would brighten homes that once relied upon lanterns. New generations would enter classrooms very different from this one. Yet somewhere in their hearts, many would always remember a small white schoolhouse standing alone beneath an endless American sky. They would remember the comforting warmth of the cast-iron stove on snowy mornings, the scent of chalk and pine, the soft ring of the brass bell, the patient voice of a teacher who believed every child deserved encouragement. And perhaps, on a quiet evening many years later, while watching their own children open a favorite book or carefully write their first letters, they would smile without fully realizing why. Because long ago, in the peaceful autumn and winter of 1885, an ordinary American schoolteacher quietly planted something that could never be measured. Not simply knowledge, but curiosity, character, hope. Those gentle gifts passed silently from one generation to the next, just as surely as the changing seasons crossed the wide American prairie beneath the moonlit sky. Tonight, dear friend, as you let your own thoughts grow softer and your breathing slower, perhaps you can still imagine that little schoolhouse standing peacefully beneath the stars, its windows dark now, its bell resting quietly, its lessons carried onward in the hearts of those who once sat inside. And somewhere beyond the whispering grasses, the prairie wind continues its timeless song, inviting another traveler to rest, to dream, and to remember the quiet beauty found in the ordinary moments of history. Good night.